Hi, everyone. I am Laura Ackerman. I am the marketing lead here at Ellevate Network, and I will be your host for today. So thank you so much for joining us for this session of Mobilize Women Week, When Priorities Change. Mobilize Women is a movement based on the Ellevate Network's purpose of achieving equality for all. We work toward equality by giving diverse voices, particularly those of women, a seat at the table where decisions are made. Today, we believe highlighting those voices, opinions, and stories is even more important than ever. Because of the times we're living through now, we couldn't host our usual in-person full-day summit. So we put together a perhaps even better week-long virtual experience for everyone. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ellevate, we are a coalition of ambitious, supportive women and allies who show up for each other and mobilize to change the culture of business. We believe that no matter what your goals are or what challenges you're facing, having people you can turn to is invaluable. Throughout this week-long experience, you'll first have a chance to engage in candid discussions with some of today's most thought-provoking leaders. And then through our signature events, you'll get a chance to meet and develop relationships with other people who, like you, want to use their power and influence for equality. Because our community is the largest of its kind, we know that navigating a sea of faceless connections is a waste of time. And that's why we'll always prioritize creating real, authentic relationships, the ones that can make a difference in your future. And we do that by making sure all of our programming, from our local in-person events, our 12-week squads program, to our virtual events, are all meant to provide you with the opportunity to meet and grow relationships with those who can help, all while brushing up on topics that are relevant to you. And today, Mobilize Women is no exception. Our capstone event lies at the center of our mission. It's through Mobilize Women that we take the time to reflect our own journey, commit to making a mark on our workplaces, and to using our voices and power across the community at large. Because after all, change doesn't happen magically. It's up to all of us. So during today's session, we will be joined by incredible speakers, and there will be time for them to answer your questions at the end. But first, a few housekeeping tips. Please use the chat function to engage with each other and with our speakers. Quote cool things you hear to amplify the message, drop helpful links to life-changing books, websites, or apps, because we're all one big community showing up together. So let's get connecting. Also, post your questions in the Q&A box for the moderator to see, and click the CC closed captions icon to toggle them on. If need be, you can privately message the Ellevate team. We're identifiable as the host and co-host of the session, and we have Ellevate in our names. We are recording this session and streaming to Ellevate's Facebook page. The recording will be posted to the Ellevate site for our members to view as an evergreen resource. And did you know you can become a free member today? Head over to ellevatenetwork.com. And last but not least, please go to mobilizewomen2020.com to have a true Mobilize Women experience where actions speak louder than words. Find, learn, act, engage activities for each session, share your pics and posts with each other from your part of the universe. Use hashtag Mobilize Women to share what you're learning. We're big, we're global, but we're always in this together. Thank you for tuning in, and please welcome Christy Wallace, CEO of Ellevate Network, Wendy Gonzalez, CEO of Samasource, Michelle Nunn, CEO of Care USA, and Paula Avila Gijen, Executive Director of Women's Equality Center. And now over to Christy to kick us off.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. If you've been to a previous Mobilize Women Summit, my guess is that you learned something new. You were exposed to identities, to narratives, to situations that opened your mind. That you became more compassionate and passionate and took action on issues that affected you and affected your community. And that's central to what Ellevate is all about. Yes, we want to see more women in leadership. We want to see you succeed, but we want to see you change the world. And we know that you can. Ironically, when we had initially planned the in-person Mobilize Women Summit for June, this panel topic, when priorities change, was still on the docket. It was still on the agenda. Because priorities do change, they shift all the time. And having leaders who can lead during that time, who can navigate those changes and come out stronger and better is so critically important, not just now, but always. So now after the past couple of months, when we've seen our world turned upside down on so many levels, I am beyond inspired and amazed by the women you're going to hear from today who have led through change, who are continuing to take action, who are continuing to do more and to do better. But I'm looking at all of you here with us today because I know you can do that too. Ellevate is such a powerful community, a community of others who want to lift each other up, who want to understand what's happening in our world, and who are creating the new form of leadership. Leaders who lead with compassion, with conviction, with action. We need more leaders like you, and we're here to help make that happen. So I encourage you to join us for as many sessions as you can this week. We're having 3 to 4 sessions every day. You'll be inspired by the speakers. You'll learn so much. But more importantly, you're going to build connections. Through the mentoring meetups, our small group roundtables, and beyond, this is the time for you to engage with others, to build those relationships that open doors, that create opportunity, that create awareness, that create impact. This is a powerful event. I have to say, and of course I'm a little biased, but it's my favorite event every year because I walk away feeling stronger, feeling more connected with the world and with my purpose of what I can do to create more change. Business is at the forefront of our society. It's driving our economy, it's driving innovation, it's driving disruption. But when we see leaders leading businesses from a place of integrity, from a place of impact, from a place of looking at their communities, their employees, being intentional about bias, being intentional about equality, being intentional about environmental impact, that's where business is going. And we hope that you'll join us for that ride. So I'm honored to be here today to kick off Mobilize Women Week. A huge shout out to the Ellevate team who's worked so hard on this. Absolutely, we've seen innovation within our own ranks of how we pivot to create the space for this connection, for this community, and for this content. We're going to kick it off with Wendy Gonzalez, who is the president and interim CEO of Samasource, and start our conversation now. Wendy, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Really glad to be here. Thanks, Christy.
So you took the helm of Samasource after your business partner, founder, and CEO at the time, Lila Jana, passed away. Not only has this been a personal loss for you, but it's also changed your career path and your responsibilities. I wanted to start this conversation on that personal level of how you've adapted and what this has meant for you, because we know that in business, it is very personal. It's how we're responding to things and how we're connecting to what's happening. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that experience and the impact it's had on you.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, what a year 2020 has been, that's for sure. So I joined Samasource in 2015. I was hired in by Lila, and I just absolutely gravitated not only towards her incredible vision, but really to her as a leader. I joined because I believe deeply in our social mission and thought, how incredible could it be to be, in partnership with another amazing and inspiring woman to basically really just, knock down doors and take names. I was really excited about building something great. And we did that. So I joined in 2015. And at the time, we were actually still a nonprofit. And in 18 months, with basically Lila's partnership, I transitioned us into a profitable nonprofit. We led the charge into transitioning into a for-profit company. It was absolutely incredible. And I think, just like you said, it's, as I reflect on it, you just don't sort of realize how often and how quickly you connect with people until you really miss them. I spoke to her for nearly every day, literally nearly every day, or text or chatted for almost 5 years. So when she, was diagnosed, not really just shortly after we finished our Series A fundraise. So it was like the pinnacle of this thing that we'd been working to for so long. Then she was diagnosed with her very rare and aggressive form of cancer, and was only but a handful of months after that she went on to medical leave, and I took over the reins as the kind of interim or acting CEO. And yeah, I mean, it was tough, Christy, because I thought that, well, you know, I just in my bones, I knew she was coming back, right? So I always felt like sort of a temporary thing, but really, you know, I'm very lucky to have an incredible leadership team. But yeah, we went through this process, and when we, you know, when I received, was literally talking to her up until, you know, moments before, when I received the news. Yeah, it was personally, I think, well, it was really devastating personally, because not only do you sort of lose, you know, a business partner, but you lose a friend. And recognizing, as two basically minority women who had just gone through a fundraising process, oftentimes we're the only women executives in the room, especially sitting in these investment banking meetings, to not have that partner, you know, to talk to, that was hard. Yeah.
So I have to say, I was at a conference soon after Lila passed away, and they had a special holding space event in her memory and in her honor, and it was very emotional. And her legacy is strong, and it's impactful, and it's something that extends far and wide. And that is something that now you're taking on, but also forging your own legacy and your own impact. Because for business leaders, I think it is dynamic, it's changing, in the space that our world is changing. So how are you balancing keeping that legacy, but also moving forward with your own vision?
That's a really good question, Christy. I mean, her vision. I mean, it's the same vision. This is what's really incredible about how amazing her vision was. Is it was the same. It's literally, our mission statement is the same as when she started it in 2008. So that really tells you, it kind of stands the test of time. So in terms of like honoring the vision and the vision, it's embedded into everything that we do. So one of the things that I was really, I think, excited about, I should say, in the midst of all this, is that our teams really came together. They came together to honor and see forward Delilah's legacy. You know, she, all the way down to her book, Give Work, has said that this is kind of a mission that should outlast her and live on for generations. So we take that really seriously, and, you know, operate against our core values every day. As far as, you know, how do I sort of carry forward my own leadership? I mean, Lila was one of a kind. She's incredible. One of the most brilliant speakers, and inspiring people I've ever met. And, you know, we're different. What I can do is sort of be authentic to me. So for me, I am really I'm really very focused on, data. One, I'm a huge data driven person. So part of my leadership style is, you know, data. I'm a big collaborator, but when you need to move quickly. So I like to do so in conjunction with my teams, and have really, you know, sort of done my best to forge my own path. Because at the end of the day, I think if there's one thing that I've learned, especially in this, you know, kind of transition, is that you have to be authentic to yourself and to who you are as a leader. And so that's what I've really been focused on.
And as a leader, your title is currently interim CEO. So how does that, you know, has that transitional type title impact you, your role within the organization, but also, I mean, more broadly, I feel, to be honest, I'm personally interim in so many things right now, because as parent, as partner, as members of community, there's so much transition, there's so much that feels like it's lacking in permanence. So with your specific title, how is that connecting you to the future and the vision and where you're going personally?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I mean, as you can imagine, you know, none of us wanted to be in this circumstance, right? So how this kind of all came about, I was really hoping all the way up through, you know, through January, until I received the call that Lila was going to be coming back to, you know, coming back to Sama. So as you can imagine, like I get it, you know, from a board perspective, from a, you know, an investor perspective. uh we came to the situation in a very, you know, unfortunate situation. So when that happens, it's critical to take all the appropriate sort of steps to, do due diligence to make sure that the company is in the best possible hands. So yeah, impermanence, I mean, would I have loved for this to be like sorted out? Yeah, the short answer is yes. But the way that I look at it is like this mission and this company is so much bigger than me. Um, we have literally thousands of people in sub-Saharan Africa that we're working around the clock to make sure have not only kind of continuity employment, but that we can really grow ourselves as an organization. The bigger we get, the more impact that we have. There are teams of people that are employees that are counting on me as well. So I'm moving forward as if this was as permanent as possibly can be. And I think the key thing is just to be able to handle what comes your way, because not long after Lila passed away, COVID happened. And so every day we're dealing with things now. We're dealing with the fires here in California. So it's I'm doing my best to keep the mission driving forward, and making decisions when you gotta make decisions.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about the shift from nonprofit to for-profit, and this is something that I think about a lot because, Ellevate's a B Corp. B Corps, for those that don't know, are businesses committed to, for-profit businesses committed to doing social good. So really looking at our impact on our employees, on our communities, on the environment, but continuing to be, profitable, successful businesses with the underlying vision and values. And for a long time, when I came in as CEO of Ellevate, the question was always, well, you're a nonprofit, right? And that was the assumption, that to do good, to have an organization that's creating change, you would be a nonprofit. And we're seeing a market shift away from that. And I'm not knocking nonprofits. What I'm saying is that, all businesses can have that underlying impact and mission. And so, Wendy, with Samasource, you did go from a nonprofit to a for-profit. And I would love for you to share a little bit about the decision making there and how that process worked out for you.
Yeah, I think had B Corps been prominent back in 2008, that's actually how we would have started. It was because it just wasn't really that much of a thing back at that point in time. So because traditional fundraising did not really, they thought the idea of purposeful hiring, in underserved communities in sub-Saharan Africa kind of sounded like a risky bet. So we weren't able to get traditional funding, so we went the nonprofit route. But at the end of the day, 100% would we do it this way again and keep with the transition to for-profit? I think the answer is absolutely yes, because what it allowed us to do when we were making this decision was that at the end of the day, the mission is the thing that's most critical, that we grow in size and scale. So the bigger that Samasource gets to prove that purposeful hiring of 50% women, 50, gender equality, equal pay, purposeful hiring in underserved communities to people who otherwise would not have that opportunity, to actually demonstrate and show that this, you can do good while doing well. Scale is really important. And so we knew to really carry this forward, we had to scale. And getting into traditional forms of financing was really important, Christy, because not only do we have this really important social mission, we also are a technology company. So we focus on artificial intelligence, and traditional forms of financing allow us to get, connected not only to advisors, in the space where are, kind of at the top of their game and on the leading edge, but also gave us a larger range of capital to access. So we went through this process, and I love this topic, so I'll try not to go into too much depth here.
I love it too. So it's, yes, share away.
There were a few things that were really, really important to us. The first is that at the end of the day, we wanted the nonprofit to have a windfall. So instead of sort of like, we didn't shut down and restart as a for-profit, we actually transferred the assets from the nonprofit to the for-profit. What that meant was that the nonprofit got sort of fair market value of all of the work that had been done to date. And the nonprofit was basically the majority owner, the whole owner. Then when we invited investors in, the nonprofit stayed the majority shareholder. And we actually did that very much on purpose. Number one is to have representation of our mission and, the nonprofit's interests. The second is that when this business does really well, which we hope it does, both for the sake of impact, but also for our shareholders, that at the end of the day, it's the nonprofit that benefits. So the whole idea, we actually changed our nonprofit's name to the Lila Jana Foundation in honor of Lila. But the entire idea that we had here was that we do super well in Sama. It keeps growing impact every step of the way. Then we take the windfall from from hopefully the great results of Sama Source and use it to spin off other social enterprises.
Love that. I mean, that's, thinking about the systemic impact and how, it's kind of all interconnected, starting, today, and then how that can continue to build and grow over time. But, central to that too, as we talk about impact and we talk about business, is understanding your customers, understanding who are the communities you're impacting, who are you serving. And as a leader, sometimes, you can get disconnected from that. I think we always at the core want to be so deeply connected with our communities and to understand if you don't know what your customer needs, then you're not going to best be able to solve their problem. But how do you stay connected with your communities, with your mission, with your customers?
Oh yeah, well, staying connected with the teams, I'm sure like everybody is, we're trying to do as much of the virtual thing as possible. So everything from virtual happy hours and like Jackbox trivia games. I have to admit, I usually would have been in East Africa at least like 3 or 4 times this year. So I'm missing my teammates and missing, giving hugs and all the stuff that would normally happen. So we're finding ways to connect virtually, even if that means, having to have a morning happy hour, with our East African friends. I'm willing to make that sacrifice. But otherwise, I do my best to stay in touch with our clients. We have our regular business meetings, but I make it a point to at least once a month to get connected to one of our customers just to check in, how are we doing? What's working well? How has COVID affected your business? What can we do to be a better partner in this time? And I found more than anything, especially given the pandemic and needing to really focus on business continuity, because we provide, mission critical or business critical functions for many of our customers, was that we're as, connected as ever, making sure that there's no interruption, in data and solutions, which, probably a whole nother topic, Christy, but as you can imagine with our impact mission, it was quite a interesting effort to move our teams virtual. So yeah, it's been good.
Thank you, Wendy. So Wendy, we are going to move on to our next one-on-one chat, but don't fear all of our attendees. Wendy will come back for the Q&A at the end of this session. So if you have questions for Wendy, please post them in the chat. And now we're going to move on to a one-on-one conversation with Paula Avia Gigen. Sorry, Paula, I was practicing that. Executive Director of the Women's Equality Center. So Paula, love to have you join us. And I'm just pinning your video. So Paula, you are having such a huge impact when it comes to women in health. And we've heard a lot during, prior to the pandemic, but especially during this time, the impacts on women, both economically, health, responsibilities in the home place. We've been talking about health nonstop, not just COVID, but the access to health or lack of access to it, and how those systems and structures are creating greater divides and inequalities. But this isn't a new issue. This isn't new to our world and society. And so I would love to hear from you a little bit more about how the pandemic has shifted your focus, if at all, and what issues around women's rights have been exacerbated during this time.
Hi, Christy and everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. The pandemic clearly has shaped our focus and our priorities. And I'm going to start from a personal point of view. At the beginning of even before everything started, the beginning of the year, early February, I found out I was pregnant. I am actually like 8 months pregnant, so very pregnant here. And when the pandemic hit, all my priorities and my expectations of what I expected to be pregnancy like completely shift. All the ideas of even having my partner being involved and being part of the process or feeling safe going to a hospital completely changed it. We end up, my husband has only been able to be in one of the appointments, and we start considering the possibility of a home birth, even though it was something that initially I never thought that I wanted to have, just because going to a hospital became a risk. Even some of my doctor was like, I want to keep you as far away from here as I can. And when some of those changes happened, it also hit me that I needed to check in with all of our partners all over the region, because if in the United States and in the privilege that we have of living here, my priorities and my expectations about my reproductive health were changing, I couldn't imagine what it would be the situation around, especially Latin America, that's where we focus most of our work. And I was not surprised. The first thing, after a few check-ins in March with our partners, the first thing that we found out was abortion services were not being considered essential medical services. Therefore, women were not being able to access abortion. And in countries where they have very strict quarantines, they could not go and see a doctor if they wanted to have abortion. The second one, it was very, very quickly, there was a very big shortages of contraceptives, because the majority of contraceptives are made and are coming from Asia, and also countries close all their borders in Latin America. So we start seeing very soon, and we expected that there was going to be a higher level of unwanted pregnancies. Then, of course, it was the maternal health component. Many hospitals and many governments were not giving maternal health a priority. And we heard even from partners in Honduras, where women were forced to give birth outside the hospitals, like on the street, because they were not being expected to be inside the hospitals, because they just didn't have beds and they were given priority just to COVID. But I think the one that struck the most and it struck a chord for us was domestic violence. The rates of domestic violence all across the region just skyrocketed. The hotlines, the domestic hotlines the governments had available, all of a sudden tripled the number of calls. All of our partners start receiving requests immediately to try to support domestic violence victims, because there was a pandemic before the real pandemic, and that was the pandemic of domestic violence. And even though we knew it, we didn't know how bad it was. And COVID really put a lens for us to see it. And it was very dramatic and sad. And that immediately forced us to change a lot of our programs to make sure that we were able to support women who were in situations of domestic violence, to call governments to put enough resources into help women who were victims of domestic violence, because the majority of domestic violence cases in Latin America, at least, they are women related. And then also to even make calls and say, okay, you have all these hotels closed. Can you make these hotels available for shelters? And support our partners that were always available to offer other type of services, to maybe hire more psychologists or some type of legal support to support the women and the huge amount of calls that they were getting of women who were in very difficult situation. And so I think it forces to change a lot of our priorities, but it also kind of lifts a veil of things that were happening on the ground, and then maybe we were seeing and calling, but not as evidently.
So there's a number of things there that struck me. So you, I know, are based in the United States, but we're talking, in part about what's happening in Latin America. So there's that aspect of space, but then, and for many of us, we're, how do we connect with communities that we can't physically be there during this time? You also talked about how, domestic violence incidences rose during this time and were exacerbated. How do you, as a leader who can't be on the ground necessarily, but is seeing this shift and knowing that you need to respond now and take action and maybe, address other solutions that may not have been the solutions you tapped in before, like how was that process for you to really understand the situation and then to quickly take action to help the communities you serve?
One of the biggest challenge for us has been not being able to travel. We are in international organizations. I'm based in New York. Half of the team is all over the place. We have people in Miami, in Colombia, in Dominican Republic, in Washington, D.C. And we always try to be connected to the ground as much as we can, because when you are working with local partners, you need to sit at their table. You need to go to their spaces to be able to see eye on eye. And I think that for us, it was really hard to not be able to do that. So one of the things that we did is try to invest in technology, because also many of our partners didn't have the same services and access to technology that we could or that we do, and see how we can try to have closer connections and closer conversations. But it wasn't easy, because the trends that we were seeing were very scary. Not only in terms of the domestic violence and some of the statistics of unwanted pregnancies that we were seeing that were rising, but also how the anti-rights movement saw this as an opportunity and used the pandemic as an opportunity to restrict further our rights. And we saw that not only in Latin America, but in the United States. Very conservative groups trying to push their agenda with the use of the pandemic. And it was really hard to be able to react to what they were doing, but at the same time, be able to be effective and responsive to what our partners needed in that moment. And also the pandemic struck us in a very personal level, all of us and all over the region. So something that started happening was that even our partners usually are full of energy, and some of the most they're the strongest women and people that I know, and they really come from backgrounds that you can imagine, and they have all these. Every time we go to a trip, we arrive recharged, because it's just like it feels amazing to be with them. But then we start seeing that many of them didn't have the same level of energy and didn't have the same level of enthusiasm, and they start feeling a little defeated by their conditions, because the conditions in El Salvador were very strict and were very hard. The same with Honduras, even with Argentina. And after being through a strict lockdown for like 45 days, they just felt deflated. So I talked to our team and I was like, okay, maybe this is the time when we need to pay back and give them energy. So we start contacting them very intentionally with like, to give them optimism, to say, okay, look, it's possible. We will get through this. We will energize. And it was very nice to see how they responded to it, and how we were able to all like literally lift each other up, and how the conversations at the beginning of the calls, we needed to give extra 20 minutes just to vent about the pandemic, just to be able to see how are you handling the situation that you are having. And I think that really allowed us to be more effective in our work, but also to be better real partners.
I'd love it if you could expand upon that a little bit. So as we talk about leading through times of uncertainty, certainly now is a time, but there's many times change management, shifting in, priorities, markets, business focus. I mean, there's many times when leaders are leading during times of uncertainty. And certainly I think a lot about the impact on my teams, who are their own personal situations, but there's the economic viability, career progress, impact. But then you're talking about a broader community. You're talking about the customers you serve around the world who are in very uncertain times. And I really appreciate that perspective around being optimistic, because we can certainly get overwhelmed by and feel weighed down by a lot of what's happening. But there's that aspect of optimism which will push us forward, will push us together and forward towards, creating something better, towards navigating this time in a new way. So how are some of the ways in which you, and especially around this really important topic, you talked about creating space at the beginning of meetings and connecting with local partners, but what are some of the other ways you're really leading from a place of optimism and hope?
think that we needed to start at home, and we needed to start at the core of the organization, and that was the most important part. So one of the first things that we did was recognize that the pandemic wasn't going to affect us equally. You know, there were, even among our team members, people who were going to be affected the most, and were especially the people who have kids. Because the kids were at home, which means that we could not expect them to do 2 full-time jobs, because there is 1 full-time job that is to be a mom and then being a teacher. So technically we're 3 full-time jobs for some of our team members, and then to also be at work. So we try to accommodate as much the policies to allow them to have as flexible schedules as they can, to block their calendars when they were like teaching their kids, or when they were like in taking care, like nanny duty, they will put it. And then we, the ones who didn't have kids, we will accommodate our schedule to them. And I think that it was something that I think it hope at least send a message of how we needed to prioritize what we needed initially as a team. Because if we were not feeling great about it, we could not export that type of optimistic. The other thing was to allow us to have flexible time whenever we needed, in staying internally. To at the beginning of the pandemic, when we, at least half of the team, were like washing all of our groceries to a point they were taking so long, to like trying to go to the supermarket in times that were during work hours, so that we didn't were hitting like the hard rush hour times, to be surrounding less people. So we created one of our Slack channels that was just like pandemic talk, and be like, okay, what we need to accommodate right now? I need to right now go and take a break, or I need to go right now and go on to the supermarket because we are running out of water, or something like that. We are running out of food. And I think that helped us to feel more comfortable as a team, and that allows us to then connect with our partners from a better place. But I think the biggest call for us was to realize that if we were not okay, we would not be able to offer our partners a space to be okay. And once we were okay and we will be better, then it was easier to go and talk to our partners and lift them up.
And a lot of what you're doing is not just work now during the pandemic, but it's, you're reacting to policies, to different shifts on a local level within the communities you serve. If it's different legislation, rules, how do you manage the prioritization of that? And there's so much work to be done. Like, how do you as a leader determine where to direct energies or resources?
One of the questions I ask my team constantly is to always ask us to what end we are doing something, right? And it's like we are having an intervention or an action, and always remember what is the purpose of that, what is the end of that specific program. And I always want to know if that program is responding to a specific need, and a need that comes from the ground, and not a need that is being imposed by us, but not our priorities, but us, the larger partners have priorities. And this is personal for me when it comes to especially countries that are suffering the most. El Salvador has been a country they have been working on for, at this point, over 7 years. And the first time I visited El Salvador, I was able to go into the women's prison. And in El Salvador, they have a total abortion ban. A woman who has a miscarriage or stillbirth might be accused of having had an abortion, and then even sentenced up to 40 years in prison because of that miscarriage or stillbirth. And I was able to meet these women the first time I went, and it was a very heartbreaking situation. And we were able to have a tour of what it was, the prison at that time. They still exist, but now the women are in another facility, but it was the Ilopango prison. And we had the maternity ward, because women are allowed to be with their children up to 3 years old inside the prison. And that was supposed to be the nice part of prison, and that's what they were giving us a tour of it. And it was really heartbreaking to hear their stories and and also to see the conditions in which they were imprisoned. So every time that we are making a decision about El Salvador, I go back to that moment and I go back to that stories and I ask myself, is this getting us closer to free those women? Is this getting us closer to end the total ban? And if the answer is yes, then that is a priority. But if the answer is no, or if there's another organization already doing that work, it doesn't make sense to replicate the effort. It's always important to remember that this is not about competing about organizations doing the work, but about being the most effective for the people who need you the most. And that is the people on the ground who are struggling with their situations right now.
Thank you, Paula. So we are now going to go to our next Q&A, right when the dogs start barking. Perfect timing on my end, but we're going to go to our next Q&A. And Paula will be back with us momentarily for our final audience Q&A section. So now I welcome Michelle Nunn to the stage. And Michelle is the President and CEO of CARE USA.
Hello, can you hear me okay, Christy?
Yes, I can, Michelle. Welcome. So lovely to have you here today. So you've had a career that's been very focused on mission and values, which I love, and I cannot wait for this conversation. You've been a social entrepreneur, a nonprofit CEO, and a candidate for the U.S. Senate. So many things that we're talking about throughout Mobilize Women Week around how we take action in our businesses and our communities. How do you know where to focus CARE's efforts, particularly as you work in 100 countries? So we started talking about this in the previous conversation. I think it's important, especially as we look at global leadership and different communities and priorities. How do you make it through the day and make all those decisions and focus energies, particularly during a time when priorities are shifting?
Yeah, well, it's such a hard question for all of us, I think now. And I heard Paula ultimately say that it is, I think we're always keeping in mind who are we serving and how can we maximize the impact of our service and engagement. So for CARE, we have a 75-year history. Most people know when they send a care package to camp or to their grandparent or whatever, they know that it's a sign of generosity and connection and love, but they may not know that it actually originated with the organization CARE that I'm a part of, and it was sending refugees in post-World War II Europe care packages. And that was the invention of what became the idea of this gift of, again, solidarity and connection. So at this particular moment, I think there has never been a more important moment in CARE's 75 years of history for connection, solidarity, and also a demonstration of our interdependence. So one of the things that's different about this moment is CARE knows how to operate in an emergency, and we have done it for decades, but we have never responded, for instance, in 67 countries at once to an emergency. And so for now, what we're trying to do is ensure that we are following the leadership of our teams around the world. 95% of our teams come from the countries in which they're serving, and that we're trying to allocate resources towards where we can have the highest impact. And for us right now, that's around the health access to ensure that we actually spread the information that will help people prevent the spread of the virus, that we equip people with some of the basics around sanitation, water. We forget that for many of us who are now washing our hands many times a day, that some people might have to walk many miles in order to have access to clean water. CARE has just in the last few months built over 22,000 water stations, just as an example. And so you take that, and then in addition to that, we're also looking at some of the downstream impacts of this, hunger, for instance. Think about the challenges we're all having as moms, and then think about what it would mean if we had to make choices around who could eat in our family, or how many meals each day we would be able to afford for our families. So those are the kinds of questions that CARE is asking every single day, and that we're empowering our leadership around the world to be able to answer.
Thank you, Michelle. For many of our attendees today, that typically as CEO, your vision, your thinking, your brain is, years out, right? And you're kind of, where are we going? And then you go backwards into how we get there. But it's really about planning for the future. how are you approaching that during a time when the future is so uncertain, and helping to allocate resources, priorities, and looking forward during this time?
Well, it's such a good question because I think we are all so in the moment. I have a friend who said that this is life without punctuation, right? There's no semicolons or periods, or it just feels like you also have no sense of when is this going to change. And so I think, and also the enormity of the things that we're dealing with right now. So I know that we're all learning a level of agility that we didn't necessarily even think was possible, and our teams are demonstrating that every single day in such powerful ways. I think we're learning the importance of communication, and I think we're also learning the importance of pivoting and doing things differently. So, CARE has a plan that takes us to 2030. I would say it's really a vision that takes us to 2030. So we are trying to learn, how do you think about the vision of a decade ahead when you really can't predict what's going to happen next month? So how do you hold a end in sight that gives you the capacity to, for instance, look at how do we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, gender equality and defeating poverty, and at the same time, how do we respond to the urgent needs that are all around us? And I think one of the dimensions of that, I know many of those who are listening might be able to relate to this, is, for instance, how do we plan our budget next year, right? With the enormity of the uncertainty that's around us. And so trying to think about how do you be bold, but also realistic. And I think one of the things that we are just ensuring is that we have the capacity to change, and that we know that we are monitoring the work that we're doing, and that's everything from revenue and expenses to our impact, and then we are ready to make changes when we're called upon to do that.
How has your leadership style changed during this time, or has it changed?
People keep asking, like, is this pandemic changing history or is it accelerating history? I sort of feel like it's just accelerating some of the things that we are all trying to practice already, and from a leadership perspective. And so for me, I think it's, again, how do we call upon the experience of what we know? And from CARE's perspective, as an example, we had dozens of projects dealing with the Ebola epidemic. And so how are we taking what we learned there, as an example, that almost as many women died from childbirth as a result of being displaced from healthcare systems as a result of Ebola, as they did Ebola itself. And so how are we taking important lessons of the past, of our own leadership, of our own organizational experiences, and then again, I think, how are we making decisions quickly? How are we calling upon the aspirations of our team to be a part of a mission that we all know is critically important, and that's true for businesses across the board and organizations across the board. And then I think, how are we all being better communicators, and how are we also showing empathy and solidarity, because everyone is doing hard things right now, and how are we accommodating one another and giving each other, again, the consideration that we need based upon very different circumstances, perhaps, but across the board, people are struggling.
This is a little bit of a minutia question, but I'm fascinated because you were talking about as many women died from lack of access to maternal care during the time of Ebola as women who died from Ebola. And oftentimes we are looking at kind of the headline issue when it comes to, how we're serving our communities. But that's definitely an impact, a secondary impact, or whatever the right framing of that is, that's important to understand. But it takes kind of digging into the data and digging into really asking those questions, really, looking at the problem from many different perspectives to understand, okay, what aren't we seeing? What else is happening here? What else do we need to do? Is that a regular practice for you, or is that just, you're something you've internalized within your teams to kind of ask those hard questions, to not just address what might be in front of our face, but to really see more broadly where we can have an impact?
Yeah, I think it's so important. And I know that we're all trying to use data in new ways and try and ensure that we actually are basing decisions as much as possible on facts. And so, for instance, one of the examples for care is we do something that's called a rapid gender assessment in an emergency. And it means we go in and we say, what are the impacts of this emergency, whether that's a flood or a drought or a hurricane or anything else, a civil war, on women and girls, because oftentimes the humanitarian response is not taking into account some of the issues that, for instance, a nursing mother might have, or the fact that that women have lost all access to family planning during times of emergency. Or the fact that most women who die in childbirth do so in emergency context. And so these rapid gender assessments actually help us to make sure that we are informing the broader, both governments and humanitarian actors around the specific needs of women and girls. And we've done 54 in the last few months in countries around the world to actually ensure that we were not just sort of assuming what women and girls needed, but really basing it upon their own voice, what they themselves are telling us, but also the data. And so one of the things that we learn when we do these rapid gender assessments, as an example, is that that we can see from the numbers that women are at the forefront of the response. 70 to 80% of frontline caregivers are women, but only a much smaller percentage are actually leading the response. So even in the United States, the task force around COVID, 27 members, 2 of them are women. And so think about the discrepancy between, again, frontline leadership and architecture of the leadership. And we need to align those things. But we wouldn't know that if we weren't looking at some of the data. So I do think we have to really look at what, as you're suggesting, what is actually happening. And in this instance, also, what are the secondary impacts? We're realizing that for women around the world, they're facing excruciating choices. But am I going to go out and take the chance of spreading or contracting the virus, or am I going to feed my family today? And you know, they're having to make those choices based upon hunger. So, you know, are we ensuring that we're addressing not only the health concerns of the virus, but also the secondary dimensions like hunger and gender-based violence, which we talked about a little bit, but we have to base this around the voices of women and girls, but also the data.
And how has this time been for you personally, if you don't mind me asking? And I'll give you context for why I'm asking. I lead a corporate executive roundtable through Ellevate every week. And it's small groups of senior executives in business who are coming together to support each other during this time. And inevitably, every conversation, if we're talking about how to best support our teams, our companies, our missions, it comes back to the individual. How are we personally navigating this that makes us stronger and better to lead the teams, to lead the businesses, to change the world? So starting with yourself is such a central place, but I think a space we don't oftentimes give ourselves the freedom to address and to really be proactive about, you know, our own self-care and priorities. So what has this time been like for you personally?
Well, yes, it is easy, I think, to neglect, especially at times when we're feeling the weight of the world from a leadership perspective, to neglect, as you say, our own self-care. And I would say it has, you know, it's been a very challenging time for everyone. And I have to put that in perspective because, for instance, I know that that some of our team members around the world are facing much greater difficulties and much greater challenges. But I have 2 teenagers, and so many of us know what that means. And I know it's even harder in many ways with younger children right now. But today was the first day back of virtual school for my kids. We are navigating that. We're trying to find solace and consolation around the places where we can, which are the opportunity to be together in different ways. And yet, as my teenagers said, like, Mom, this, you know, the first few weeks of this, like, this is your dream. We're stuck with you. You know, we can't leave. And So it's, and not their dream, obviously, because they are ready to move out into the world. But I have found, and I'm trying to find, especially hard, I think, for those of us who our work days could extend throughout 24 hours, to how do we find some time for reflection, for the kind of, as you say, the vision work that we need to be doing, in addition to the immediacy of what we're trying to deal with every day. And for me, I guess one of the biggest things is lots of walks and lots of audiobooks. That's been one of my consolation prizes from this time. But I think it is so important for all of us to find the ways that we can support and nurture ourselves, because, as you say, there's no particular end in sight here. And I think we have to think about this as something that we're sustaining over the longer term.
Yeah, I love all of that, and thank you for sharing. My 5-year-old has her favorite phrase these days is, when coronavirus is over, that's what she calls it. Can I start doing gymnastics again? Can I go, to an amusement park? So we're creating a bucket list for,
yes, that's so good,
in the future. But pertaining to business, there's that bucket list too. We keep talking about build back better, build back equal, like using this as a time to really catalyze those changes that we've talked about in terms of equality and equity in the world, and specifically in business. And how do you see the attendees today doing that in their own lives? How do we all use this as a catalyst for building back better? What is your vision around that?
Yeah. Well, I do think that we can look at history, and it tells us that times of great transformation and tumultuous and often very difficult times of war, for instance, become times also where it is possible for social norms to change. We see that often. And so I think one of the things that we all want to be thinking about is, how can we use this extraordinarily challenging time to, for instance, lift up gender equality as an example? And what are we doing towards that end? We know that, for instance, that from a political perspective, that one of the areas where women are farthest behind is political representation. And that's here in the US, that's also around the world. But we also can see during this time of crisis that women leaders have done some of the most masterful jobs in dealing with this crisis. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think about, how are we using our voice from an advocacy perspective, from a public policy perspective, from just a pure getting out the vote perspective. We have a really important consequential election coming up in the United States, but everywhere around the world, how are women using their voices? And then I think also, how are we supporting causes that matter? There are extraordinary civil society organizations that are doing critical work. From a care perspective, we are looking for supporters, from donors, from advocates, all of those things. But there's so many ways that I think people can stand up and step up in this moment. And I think it is also a way, frankly, of enduring a very difficult time, is to feel your own sense of agency and purpose at this moment. And so I really hope that people are finding that, again, whether it's within their own workplaces, within their own communities, nations, and also acting at a global level as well.
Thank you, Michelle. I couldn't agree more. And for those that are interested, we have a Women in Politics panel on Thursday afternoon, so we can post that in the chat. Michelle, one final question for you before we get to the audience Q&A. If anyone has questions, please post them in the chat. There's the Q&A function, and we will try to get to them all. But how are you preparing now for the future after the pandemic? What things do you think will continue to be relevant for the foreseeable future? We touched on this a little bit earlier as we talked about that business leadership, that planning. We're now talking about what our individual attendees can do and the impacts that they can have. Obviously, having an impact is a personal, it's what resonates with you personally, but are there specific areas that our community should really be looking at that are going to not just end when the pandemic ends, but continue to be systemic problems within our society that we should pay attention to and see how we can continue to address now and in the future?
Yeah, well, I think we've been given a very difficult gift to bear, but if we use it, it is a gift that could help us be more powerful and stronger in the future, which is that the pandemic has revealed the extraordinary inequities in our societies and around the world. And if we face into those inequities in a really meaningful way, then we are going to be compelled to do something about those inequities. And so whether that's racial inequities, whether that's the knowledge that the most marginalized are suffering the worst, and that is always what happens in times of disaster. And that's true, for instance, women around the world in times of crisis, because so often in so many places they are the most marginalized, they also suffer the greatest consequences. We have seen that again in terms of the consequences of unemployment. Half of the women that we work with in, for instance, Gaza, West Bank, have lost their jobs. If you think about all of these pieces of hunger affect women and girls more disproportionately, but also I think we have, as we go forward, the ability to both look at those inequities, but also to do something about them. And if we bring the full power of for instance, all women and girls, into the equation as an example, then we know that we will be a more powerful society, set of communities, and stronger economies, better led, a whole set of things that we know are true. So I just think that this particular crisis gives us a unique window into doing things differently and the imperative for us to act upon the enormity of the inequities. And we have these sustainable development goals for the next 10 years, and let's think about how do we really live into those, especially at a time when we know that more people are going to be falling into poverty, and that some of those benchmarks of progress that we had counted upon are being are really being challenged. So again, I think it gives us an urgent call to action.
Thank you, Michelle. And we're going to bring all of the panelists, Michelle, Paula, and Wendy, up on the screen now for Q&A. But I want to preface, before we get into the Q&A, just the perspective we took with this conversation. We're talking globally what's happening in our world more broadly. And I think as leaders and as citizens and humans, understanding the big scope of what our world is like and what the situations we're living in, the situations that others are living in that we don't read about in the paper every day, that aren't top of mind, that we may not be hearing those stories. But when you want to really affect change, it's starting, zoom out, look at really what the big picture is, learn, understand, and then throughout the course of this week, we're going to help you zoom into the specific topics and areas that are relevant to you, that we can continue to have these conversations and go deeper, to do more and to do better. But to really set the stage, we wanted to be able to have conversations about how we are leading businesses during times of change, but leading businesses that are impacting huge areas of our world and communities that may not be facing the same hardships that you are today, but are still facing hardships. But we're tackling all of this in ways that are applicable to many aspects of business in the world. And so we wanted to really start from that big worldview, and then over the course of the week, we'll continue to build on this through the conversations we have. But as we get into the Q&A, I'm just pulling up some of these questions here. So sometimes change is just so overwhelming. We've spoken a bit about purpose and mission this morning, but how do you remain steadfast to this purpose and mission when this overwhelm hits? So Michelle, if you would kick us off there about just, how do you continue to stay strong during times when, the overwhelm hits hard?
I would say that I look, and I think Paula mentioned this, I look to the women around the world that are participants in CARE's programming. And for instance, CARE runs the largest micro savings program in the world. We have 7 million women in 50 different countries that form small groups and save together and support one another. And so we're talking to our groups in some of the most difficult and challenge communities in West Africa. And these women are facing hunger, they're facing issues of gender-based violence, they're facing the obvious health challenges that COVID presents, and they are yet taking on leadership. And one of the mantras that they have adopted, that one of them coined, was "Impossible is not for us." And so I think that that's a mantra for us all to aspire to, and to lean into the solidarity and inspiration that we can provide to one another.
Thanks, Michelle. Wendy, a question for you. How can we be better leaders in times of change, not only in reference to the pandemic, but also in reference to the race conversations that we're having in the US today? And this is something we've seen a number of leaders speak out about racism in the US and beyond, but there's a lot of conversation about how that becomes not just a singular moment of acknowledgement, but also creating systemic change and really doing more through the power of leadership to address these issues.
Yeah, I think honestly, at the end of the day, it really is all about action, and no matter what, you can always do better. So as all the different activities and incredible protests were happening here in the U.S. and abroad, we took a look at what we do here at SAMA, and we have a 50% female hiring policy. I'm very proud of that. That just extends not only from our workers in Kenya and Uganda, but all the way up through management. But how can we do better? So we took a look at, okay, let's look at both gender diversity and ethnicity diversity across our entire set of offices, and immediately said, okay, what can we do from a diversity and inclusion standpoint? How do we evaluate not only what our practices are, but what our results are? So I think that, honestly, purposeful action in particular as it relates to social justice is pretty much the most important thing you can do. So if we want to have a more representative and diverse community, and in particular where we work, which is artificial intelligence, I think is probably the most pressing issue that we have right now, is getting better representation into the people who build these models. So yeah, while I'm proud of what we've done so far, the first thing we did was is how can we do better, and how do we put that into action, and how do we measure it on a monthly basis?
Thank you. Paula, how can we be better leaders? Reading the wrong one. How can you become a solid decision maker without being pressured or affected by a past event or decision where you made a mistake? So, no one's perfect. We make a lot of decisions that, are work, and sometimes they don't. But how do you keep, I think, the confidence going, the conviction in your leadership?
I think that this is it's a great question, and I also want to connect it a little bit with the previous question, and it's starting by recognize where we have made mistakes, and that as leaders we are not perfect, and that therefore the first step that we need to do is to say, we are not going to make perfect decisions, and that cannot create the expectations among our team that is part of the process, and to be able to have difficult conversations, not only with ourselves, but our entire team. It is something that we have seen in the last few months around the race conversation, and specifically in the women's rights movement and in the reproductive rights movement, is that maybe the women who are being affected the most by the reproductive rights policies are not necessarily the ones leading the conversation. When we look about and the organizations that are leading these changes, they are not necessarily leading. The majority of them are being led by white women, when we know that Black women and women of color are the ones who are disproportionately affected by that. And that has sparked a lot of conversations, and a lot of difficult conversations. And there are conversations that we must have, because if we are not able to have that type of conversations and to be able to be and hold each other accountable, then we can never progress. And then we just will get overwhelmed by all the changes and by everything, but we will never evolve. We will never be better leaders. And I think that another conversation this is starting to happen, but that we still have not been able to address fully, is the conversation about class. And this is very important as well, and it's something that we can do very proactively in our work, because many of the women of color, and I am speaking from my own privilege, I am what we will call the good immigrant. I feed out certain characteristics because I assimilate very well, because I was able to speak English, because I was able to pull many privilege. But I know the story of many people who have come here, and they are amazing and smart and can offer so much. And I think one of the tips that we try to bring to make sure that we are talking really about diversity, and that we are really talking about being holding each other accountable, is just look at those entry-level jobs and maybe compare a little bit of the person who did all the internships that needed to be done versus the person who worked at the mall. And maybe bring the person who worked at the mall and ask them, why did you choose to work at the mall instead of going to Congress? And when we are going to do an internship, and then we will realize that many of those opportunities simply were opportunities out of privilege, because many of those internships didn't pay, or it paid very little, and their parents didn't have the opportunity to support the rent in DC or in New York. And many of the people who work at the mall, it's just because I have to, because I had many of those options. And how does affect their entry level, and then leading up to being caught up to be leaders in organization, is it creates a lot of impact. And I think that if we really want to be leaders, and especially we as women want to be the new leaders and leaders of these, we need to do things our own way. We need to forget about the stereotypes, sexist, and they were created by men, and sometimes we just tend to follow. We need to really center humans, and we need to center principles that are important for us to center. We need to recognize that we are not perfect. We need to recognize that we have bad days and good days. We need to recognize that we may need to take care of a family member and create policies that really support us. We need to recognize that many of us want also to be mothers. We need to recognize that we are not going to be different leaders if we just follow the patterns that were created before us. And I think that just to end in this, only until we hold each other accountable, until we are able to have those hard conversations, we are going to be able to be the leaders that we should be, and that we want to inspire others to be.
Thank you, Paula. That's so well said. Thank you for that. Michelle, as a past candidate for U.S. Senate, how would you recommend young professionals get involved in politics so they can work their way up to a role where they can have a strong impact?
Yeah, I am always encouraging. I wish I could do everybody raise your hand if you ever have considered running for office, because it's usually not enough people that raise their hands. And so I guess the first thing I would say is that that everyone should think about it, because it really is so important. And whether you find that that's your calling or not, the opportunity to consider it, I think, is really important. And I think too often women don't consider running for office. But it doesn't have to be running for office, right? You can support others in running for office. You can engage yourselves in elections. You can engage yourself and for instance, there's so many opportunities right now. I live in a state where, for instance, our voting has been challenged in many different ways. And so people can stand up and become poll workers, and you can get involved in parties, and you can get involved on the issues based upon an organization and a set of values that you want to be engaged in. But I would just remind everyone that if you look again at the distance that we have yet to travel in order to achieve true gender equality, that one of the things that is most marked is, again, that we are very far distance from 50% participation, equal participation at leadership within politics. And I think it can be a daunting and scary thing, but I think we're seeing examples of it, and it is, to Paula's point, is starting to change. We're seeing how to change change the composition of leadership. And it makes an enormous difference. And so I guess my challenge for everyone would be, even if it's just a small step, think about how you might engage yourself, not only on volunteer activities in the civic space of nonprofits, but also in the political space. And everyone should at least give some consideration to running for office.
Yes, all right. Such great comments, insights today. Can't tell you how much I've learned, and I appreciate all of this. To our attendees, the next session we have at 4 o'clock, mental health. It's okay to not be okay. Tomorrow, tons of events, our mentoring meetup, which is a great time to connect with others. That's at 3 Eastern, human-centered policies at 1, and events throughout the week. So check out mobilizewomen2020.com for more information and to connect with others. And if you found this valuable, share with your friends, share with your communities. Let's get more people involved in this conversation. Women and allies, we can do more. It is the time for us to do more. I learned a great deal today, and just thank you so much, Wendy, Michelle, and Paula, for being a part of this important conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. We'll see you at the next session.
Bye-bye.